Welcome to Remember Me by Vivos, the show about living life to its fullest, leaving a legacy, and deciding how you will be remembered. And now, your humble team of expert planners taking the legal world by storm.
Hi, welcome to Remember Me. I'm Glenn Wagstaff. I'm here in the studio with Mike Black, and we have a special guest with us today. So today's show is sponsored by Vivos, and we're talking about, over the last few weeks, we've talked about the role that parents have over managing assets and taking care of, their child's future and establishing a legacy of, education and money and so on and so forth that they want to leave behind. And today we're going to explore a little bit about those domestic relationships that maybe don't go, the way that we envisioned at the beginning. What happens in the case of, divorce scenarios and split families and blended families, and get a little bit into that planning aspect of things. So today we have a special guest, Hayli DIckey, who has an independent law practice and, does a lot of work in the family law arena. And with your family law practice, you work with Peace Legal. So tell us a little bit about Peace Legal. Sure.
Peace Legal, we're a firm, and really our largest focus is on family law. That's where we'd like to specialize. And my role at Peace Legal is I take exclusively family law cases. So divorces, custody issues, guardianships, those types of cases where families aren't getting along.
So, and then your practice, when it relates to kind of planning for these families after the family law matters are taken care of, and on the estate planning side is through Vivos. And so, I'm actually, the relationship between Vivos and Peace Legal is really interesting, but just a very different approach to the legal industry. So tell us about some of the things that Peace Legal does differently from other law firms.
Sure. So all of the attorneys at Peace Legal are actually contract attorneys. So we do all have our own independent practices where we're able to pursue our own personal leads, our own referrals as well. But Peace Legal, provides sort of the infrastructure and organization for the attorneys. But really at Peace Legal, what we're focusing the most on is trying to change the industry itself, trying to make, especially in the realm of family law, just more client-friendly, so that clients feel like they're in much more control of their case is kind of our theory. And we do that in a few different ways. But mostly it's just making the client feel like their case is, the most important case that I have.
So Vivos, on the estate planning front, takes a very similar approach, I think, in providing more transparency to the client and helping them to feel more in control of the process, and really kind of having more of a predictable pricing structure and also of a predictable process. Because when you go to just a random attorney, you don't know what you're getting beforehand, and a lot of times you don't even know what they're going to charge you until after. So yeah, it's been a great relationship actually for us to be able to coordinate. We don't handle any of the day-to-day, family law or life law matters that Peace Legal handles, and then we really kind of focus on at Vivos the planning side of things, of tax planning and estate planning and that sort of things. And it's interesting, really, I think exciting to have you here, because you have a kind of a foot in both worlds and really kind of specialize in that space of helping people who are going through sometimes the most difficult times in their lives. Why do you enjoy working with clients at that moment?
And that's a great question, because I think that it's a difficult, these are probably some of the worst times of these people's lives. I mean, certainly. And I think that it is so important and imperative that the attorney be aware of the needs of these parties. And I think that relates so easily to estate planning. But I think in estate planning, it's a little bit different because it's not as contentious of a setting. However, there's a caveat where in these blended family situations where these cases are a little bit more contentious, actually, where you have spouses that are sitting down and trying to plan what their estate looks like, but they have children from a prior marriage that aren't related to, blood related to the new spouse, and there's some contention there. Actually, I come from a blended family, and I've been talking to my family about setting up their estate planning, and it has been much different than I imagined the conversation would be. Just because in my experience with other estate planning, it's been very, the spouses, neither of them had previous marriages. They have their kids. They're kind of all on the same page about what they want in terms of inheriting. And I think that until you have the conversation and you're really doing your planning, you don't know that you're not really on the same page in these blended families. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
Well, yeah, that's awesome, Haley. And as you mentioned, as you're introducing Peace Legal and things, that you try to help and see it from the client's perspective, because it is a terrible time in your life. And what kinds of things come up that really cause problems, cause stress between? You usually work with just one side of the equation,
right? And
you have to deal with the other lawyer and those kinds of things. So there's going to be those kinds of interactions. What kinds of things do you see, and how do you interact that way?
So, just to parse out your question more, what contentions do I see?
In a divorce scenario, what are the big things that are causing the conflicts normally?
Sure,
that's part of it. Yes.
I mean, I would definitely say differences on child rearing is a big one. Finances is a really big one. Stress and this sort of idea. This looks different for every family, I think, but just the idea that they fell out of love, whatever that means for the relationship, but just kind of a falling apart of the relationship that they once had built together is not the same as it has been. And I would say that is the most common, that people just feel like they are no longer in a close and intimate relationship with their spouse.
And now, do you see family relations with and without children, or is it usually just with children?
I see both.
And the dynamics change because of the children, right?
Yeah, I would say the most contentious cases are cases with children, certainly. And I think that there's a lot more to lose in a case with children. And so it really does yield a lot more contention in those cases, and understandably so.
So a lot of times, when you think about family law, that's where the people sometimes show their worst colors, right? And
certainly.
And when you're going through the process of a divorce, I think a lot of times divorcees imagine that once the divorce is over, everything's going to go back to normal, and it'll be a lot better and cleaner, and they won't have to deal with this other person as much. And is that usually true?
No, absolutely not. And again, from personal experience, I think that it's really, really hard to let go of how you felt about that person at the time of divorce. And maybe for the rest of your life, you're going to feel that way. And I've just seen that. I've seen that in the people that I know that have been divorced. I unfortunately have so many personal experiences in this area, but I have, unfortunately, my mother was married and was divorced to my father, and then was remarried and actually subsequently divorced her second spouse as well. And he has tragically passed away since then, and I actually set up the trust for the proceeds of the life insurance policy. And it was so interesting because the motivation for getting those proceeds put into a trust, an irrevocable trust, is so that my mom, who hasn't had any sort of relationship with, the deceased ex-spouse, the family, his side of the family, their entire motivation for wanting to protect those proceeds is so that she wouldn't have access to a cent, which is so interesting. They've been divorced for a very long time. I mean, they have adult children. It was just a very interesting, and this was the children also motivated to do that, but it's just a very interesting dynamic where those feelings, those emotions, they really don't go away in a lot of cases.
And there's a whole spectrum of scenarios that sometimes there's abuse, sometimes there's,
right.
One of the parents was incarcerated and they're a bad person, or at least they think that
right.
The other one's a bad person. And so, I mean, it can be all over the spectrum. But I think a lot of times those same issues that were coming up before of the children, who's going to take care of them, and the finances and how are they handled, and all of these issues that brought up the divorce are still issues later and that have to be dealt with. So, when we come back from the break, we're going to explore more details on some of these planning aspects. If you're listening to the show, of course, make sure that you address specific concerns in your personal scenarios with a licensed professional. Nothing that we talk about is intended to be legal advice. But when we come back, we'll get into more details working with post-divorce scenarios, blended families, and non-traditional families, and talking here with Hayli DIckey. We'll see you in just a little bit. Welcome back to Remember Me. I'm Glenn Wagstaff. I'm here in the studio with Mike Black and our special guest, Hayli DIckey, who is talking to us about post-divorce scenarios. And kind of a lot of times people think that when they go through a divorce that things are going to get so much easier once it's finished. And a lot of those issues that brought up the divorce just kind of linger. And so, one of the things we wanted to talk about was if something happens to one of the spouses after a divorce, what are the concerns of, mom dies, now there's a step parent or maybe an ex, parent involved. What are the concerns then of what happens with the estate? What are the rights, I guess I should ask, what are the rights of the natural parent of the kids in terms of the estate?
In terms of the estate or in terms of the children, in custody of the children?
Well, yeah, both.
Okay. So in terms of the estate, likely the ex-spouse, unless the kids are minors, right? If the children are minors, certainly they play a role. And that, I guess, sort of the overarching message should be, you got to plan ahead, because if these are concerns that you have and that is the relationship that you have with your ex, certainly you need to make sure that she won't be, or he or she won't be, in charge of the funds if something were to happen. And there are ways to do that, obviously. But if your spouse, if you've passed and your ex-spouse is in charge of the children or has custody of the kids and is their guardian, yeah.
So let's take a step back just for a second. The natural parent how likely is it that the ex-spouse is going to be the guardian for the kids? Extremely
likely.
Because
the biological parent right,
always has preference, right?
Right, absolutely.
And so, what about the scenarios where the biological parent is not a good person? Like they were incarcerated, they're on drugs, they were abusive or whatnot. Does the other spouse have any way to be able to, shift that away from the ex?
Sure, and absolutely. In these scenarios where, say, dad has custody, dad has remarried, the children have grown a really great relationship with stepmom, and really that couple has raised, or that relationship has raised these kids, and then say bio mom hasn't been in the picture, maybe hasn't been active in the children's life, hasn't been taking parent time, doesn't have, has sort of minimal rights and doesn't, utilize those, or has maybe a criminal history, whatever. Certainly there are ways to plan ahead to sort of at least equalize the opportunity for the step parent to maybe have custody if bio dad were to pass away.
Well, I have another question on that. From the kids' perspective, does there come a time when the kids have a choice in the matter?
So in the state of Utah, they never are able to choose outright who they're going to be with. But at the age of 14, it becomes a highly considered factor. So the judge will absolutely ask their opinion and wants to know their preference. So it's more the way that the statute reads is that the judge must take into consideration the preference of the child at the age of 14.
At the age of 14.
At the age of 14.
And where does all that get hashed out? Is it in family court or is it in probate court? And, you know, when somebody's, let's say, surviving grandparents want to be the guardian for the children, they're still minors. And of course, you know, bio mom or bio dad is still alive, and they would have preference. If the deceased parent wrote down that the preferred guardian would be, you know, their parents, and they gave specific reasons for it, the court's going to look at that and consider that, right?
Yeah, certainly. And that would be in a probate setting, right? In the guardianship, the court has actually an obligation to consider the best interests of the children. And so it is a totality of the circumstances. The court has to certainly consider the wishes of the deceased. And then also they have to do a sort of comprehensive investigation into the children's best interests. So if this parent, say this biological parent that has survived the other parent, does have this history or of maybe not being active in the children's life. I mean, even just not being active in the children's life and not fostering a meaningful relationship with the children, I think is certainly a factor that the judge is going to take into consideration. So I do think, again, the cautionary tale is plan ahead. If this is your situation, if you have kids that have a really meaningful relationship with their step parent and that parent really has taken on the role of parent, there are things that you can do to plan ahead to make sure that those relationships are at least protected.
So we talked a couple weeks ago about the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. And if something's left as an inheritance to children, somebody has to be the custodian over that money. And of course, you know, the person that's probably going to fill that role is going to be the ex-spouse, right? The natural parent of the children. Unless
otherwise designated, yes.
So in your experience working with divorcees, is that what most of them would want?
I mean, that's actually, if you ask a judge to weigh in on the issue, that's what the judge will order. So
is there a reason the judge will just naturally order that?
Yeah, they believe that the bio parents will have the best interests of the children at heart when they're making those determinations. Fortunately, they don't have any sort of fiduciary duties, you know, at that point once the children inherit that money. I mean,
So if you were to leave to a minor child an amount in trust and designate a trustee, then in essence you're taking away the decision from the court. The court doesn't have to make that decision, and the judge wouldn't decide that way, right?
Exactly. If there had been a trust that had been established that designates a trustee that's other than, you know, mom or the other biological parent, certainly the court wouldn't be able to weigh in on that issue. That issue would already be taken care of. But typically, if there isn't anything in place, the court will typically order that the guardian or the custodial parent become be able to allocate those funds.
Okay, so what other kinds of issues do you see after the divorce and, you know, all these other you see a lot of different things, but what other kinds of issues should we be aware of?
I think, again, I keep echoing my cautionary tale, but planning ahead and considering how you want to protect your children's inheritance is really kind of the way that you need to be thinking about this. Because when you bring a new spouse into the picture, that could affect their inheritance. You know, there's a good likelihood that those kids won't be inheriting the same way that they would had you not been remarried, right? There's another person to be taken care of. And also, if you don't put anything in place, there's a good chance that the kids just don't inherit. So there's a lot of issues to consider post-divorce. There's a lot of issues to consider if you had your estate planning completed as a married couple. Certainly you need to update those documents after you've, you know, the termination of that relationship.
So the risk of not updating your documents and not doing planning ahead of time, you know, you go through a divorce and then after that, one of the divorcees passes away, and maybe they've been remarried in the meantime, what's the default, of a new spouse that's not included in your estate plan because you never changed it from before? Do they have rights as part of the estate?
And I apologize. Does the new spouse have rights? So
yeah.
The husband passed away.
So they never updated their plan.
Right.
Divorcee got remarried. Now there's a new husband or a new wife in the picture, and when mom passes away or dad passes away, what does the new spouse get? What are they entitled to? Because under Utah law, for example, there's an elective share, and that would be 100%. In some cases, right? And so, obviously then the natural children who would normally be the heirs that maybe are expecting something, because the plan wasn't updated, the plan completely changes, and that's just by operation of law. So do you find that most people that go through a divorce think about these things?
No. I mean, I would say almost 99% of the time, no. People are not considering these issues. They're not considering, postmortem custody. Those are not even on their mind. Making sure they're updating their documents, if they even have documents in place, and really making sure that they are protecting the rights of their children from a prior marriage versus, acting like they've created a new traditional family, because that's just not the case. Like you said, those kids could be completely disinherited if they don't have something in place. And I think we always have people that want to take care of the kids, and the spouse is always well-intentioned, but you can't rely on that. You got to plan ahead.
Thanks for joining us, Hayli. If you want to get a hold of Hayli, or if you have further questions, call 801-477-1570. That's 801-477-1570. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.